Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. So today we're going to be doing life sciences for grade 11, mostly from this textbook, and the topic that we'll be doing is biodiversity of plants. Yeah, plants. I know a lot of people don't really like this topic and they get bored, but it's gonna be in your exam and you kind of need to pass it. Not kind of, you have to. So yeah, let's get started. Important to know that there are 4 plant groups. 4. Bryophyta, also known as bryophytes, and that includes mosses and liverworts. Second plant group is the Pteridophyta, also known as Pteridophytes, and that an example of that are ferns. Third example is the Gymnosperms. And an example of a gymnosperm is a yellowwood tree, which is also our national tree in South Africa. And then the fourth plant group is Angiosperms. An example of that would be sunflower, roses. Those are angiosperms because they're flowering plants. Okay, so let's dive into bryophytes or bryophyta. Bryophytes are the most primitive plants. They do not have vascular tissue, so that means they don't have xylem or phloem. Like you've learned about vascular tissue in grade 10, so I'm not really going to go into much detail, but they don't have vascular tissue. They don't have roots. They have what you call rhizoids, and they're not the same thing as roots because roots function like the function of roots is to absorb water from the substrate or the ground, but rhizoids, they only anchor the plant where it's situated, so they don't absorb water. And also they don't have true leaves and they don't have true stems. I'm just gonna show you this diagram here. You see, like this, even like this diagram, the term leaf is in inverted commas because it's not a real leaf and it's not a real stem. And here's the rhizoid here. It's like a root, but it's not a root. So this plant is very primitive, very, very primitive. And also what you need to know is that in bryophytes, the dominant generation is the gametophyte generation. And the gametophyte generation produces gametes and is haploid. So yeah, that's the part you see. When you see a moss plant, like this part, this is the gametophyte. I don't know if you can see it. This is the gametophyte generation and this is the sporophyte generation. This picture is a bit exaggerated, but the gametophyte is the dominant part that you see. That green thing on a moss, that's the gametophyte generation, which is dominant. And it's the only plant group that has a dominant gametophyte generation. The alteration of generations is going to be explained in a separate video because that's sort of like a process on its own. So yeah, just for now, what you need to know is that bryophytes have a dominant gametophyte generation. And what else did I leave out? Let me just look at the notes. Okay. Oh yeah, what I left out is that they don't produce seeds, they produce spores. And spores are produced by the sporophyte generation, which is diploid. 2n bracket 2n close bracket. That's how you write that. And the gametophyte generation is haploid. Okay. So also another thing, very, 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 very important. I can't believe I almost left this out. Bryophytes are dependent on water. They cannot occur in arid regions. The reason for this is because firstly, they don't have roots, and so they can't absorb water from like the environment, from the soil or whatever. So how they get their water is through osmosis. And as you know, osmosis, water moves from a high concentration to a low concentration, and it needs to be in close contact with each other. So that's why they need to be in moist environments so that the water can move along the plants. And also that kind of like holds them back from being big So most bryophytes, like they don't grow to be bigger than like 20 centimeters because they restricted because they don't have a proper form of water transportation. So yeah, that's one reason why they need to live in moist environments, because water transportation, like they don't have a proper system, and also they are dependent on water for fertilization. Like the sperm is needed to swim to the egg with like an inner water medium, so that's why water has to be there. If there's no water, then they won't be able to survive and they won't be able to reproduce because they need water. So yeah, I think I've covered everything for the bryophytes. Now we move on to the Pteridophyta. Pteridophyta, now the plants are getting more advanced in a sense where pteridophytes have vascular tissue. They've got xylem and phloem. They've got true leaves, and the leaves are compound leaves. So I'm just going to show you what compound leaves look like. They look like that. Yeah, they look like that. And on the compound leaves, this is characteristic to pteridophytes only. They have sori, which is a cluster of spores. So yeah, the cluster of spores are found on the leaves of the pteridophytes. So if you would look at a fern, it will have little black dots and stuff like that, and that's like the spores and all. And then also in pteridophytes, the dominant generation is the sporophyte generation, unlike the bryophytes where the dominant generation was the gametophyte generation. So yeah, and then also another characteristic is that they have adventitious roots, and that those roots basically help them to absorb water. So they're less dependent on water in comparison to the bryophytes, but they are still dependent on water because they need water for fertilization, where the sperm is supposed to swim to the egg. But and it's not as like they're not as dependent as bryophytes because the spores are flown like with wind and stuff like that, and then when they land and like the fertilization happens, it's only the swimming part, so it's only like a little part of their fertilization that's still dependent on water. A characteristic feature of pteridophytes is that their gametophyte generation is in the form of a heart-shaped thallus. So when the spores land on a suitable place, they will germinate and form this heart-shaped thallus, which is the gametophyte generation. And on the underside of this thallus is where the sperm and the egg will be, and then they will fuse and grow into spores, and then spores leads to sporophytes, and then that whole cycle happens again. But I don't want to get into too much detail about that. So what you just need to know is that the gametophyte generation in pteridophytes is in the form of a thallus, which is a heart shape. Okay, yeah, I think I've mentioned everything about pteridophytes. Yes, so the next plant group that we're going to be doing is the gymnosperms. So what you need to know about the gymnosperms is firstly that the reason why they're called gymnosperms is that they have naked seeds. So now we're producing seeds where bryophytes and pteridophytes were not producing seeds, they were producing spores. So now gymnosperms are advanced in the sense that they produce seeds, but these seeds are naked, hence the name gymnosperms. Okay, so the characteristics of gymnosperms: they have vascular tissue, and their vascular tissue consists of phloem and xylem tracheids instead of xylem vessels. You learned about that in grade 10, so I'm not really gonna dive much into that. But the xylem tracheids are the thing that makes the wood so soft. Gymnosperms, as I said earlier, is an example that you can think of is the yellowwood tree. Pine trees, they're an example of Gymnosperms as well. So most of them are quite woody, and they can grow to be very big. So yeah, they need a proper like water transportation system, and that's where the vascular tissue comes in. And also they have very extensive roots, and the roots like grow to be very deep because they need to be able to obtain a lot of water in order for the plants to be big. And then another thing is that the dominant generation in Gymnosperms, I know I spoke about this, the Pteridophytes. Pteridophytes has a dominant sporophyte generation. The Gymnosperms also have a dominant sporophyte generation. And one thing that you need to know is that Gymnosperms are heterosporous, which means that they produce two different kinds of spores. They produce male spores and female spores, basically girl spores and boy spores. Whereas the first two, which is Bryophyta and Pteridophyta, they were homosporous, which meant that they produce like the same type of spores. Yeah. So the two types of spores, as I said, is the girl spores and the boy spores. Okay, that's not the scientific term, but microspores are produced in the male cones, and microspores are small, but there's a lot of them. And then there's macrospores. Macrospores are produced in the female cones, and these are bigger, and their number isn't as much as the microspores. And the macrospore never leaves the female cone, so it is always the microspore that travels to the macrospore, and this process happens with wind. So gymnosperms are not dependent on water for fertilization. They are basically just dependent on wind. And so what happens is when the wind blows, lands into the female cone, and once the pollen grain lands there, it will grow a pollen tube, and this pollen tube ensures that the sperm is able to go to the ovule, which has the egg. So fertilization occurs, and then these two fuse to form a zygote. A zygote will develop into an embryo, and then the ovule will develop into a seed. So that's something new, like in comparison to the other two plant groups. So basically the seed protects the embryo inside from desiccation, and it protects it from other sorts of environmental factors. The seed has a testa, which is the seed coat, and that basically protects everything that's happening inside. And yeah, okay, so now we're moving on to the angiosperms. This is the most advanced plant group because not only does it produce seeds, but these seeds are covered. And also some angiosperms produce fruit as well, so that's like even more advanced. So if ever you're walking around and you see a plant that has a flower, just know that it's an angiosperm. Okay, so characteristics. They have vascular tissue, and they have xylem, and they've got phloem, and this is used for transportation. And the xylem has both tracheids and vessels, where in gymnosperm the xylem, it was only xylem tracheids. So now it's xylem tracheids and xylem vessels. Yeah, but you know that because you guys were in grade 10 and you guys did this in grade 10, so I'm not gonna go into detail about that. And then what you also need to know is that there are two types of angiosperms. There's monocots and there's dicots. Okay, monocots get their term for the fact that they have one cotyledon, and then dicots get their term for the fact that they have two cotyledons. Just in a short summary, a cotyledon is basically the thing that gives it acts as a food source for the seed. So yeah, monocot has one and dicot has two. The characteristics of monocots is that they have leaves that do not have a stalk. So the leaves of monocots are directly connected to the stem, and then these leaves they're narrow and they have parallel veins. If you think of maize, if you've ever seen maize, maize plant is an example of a monocot. So the leaves are directly connected to like the stem, or yeah, and the veins are parallel. Like, I'm gonna try and just show you an example of that in this book. Okay, you won't really be able to see it, but okay. That's that. The B is an example of parallel veins. So the veins are just gonna be like, if you can, just try and look at a maize plant, and then you'll see what an example of parallel veins are. And the root system in monocots, it's adventitious roots, which is similar to the roots of pteridophytes. So yeah, and then monocots, they have a less developed vascular tissue in comparison to dicots, which is why monocots, they don't really grow to be big. They're quite small and herbaceous. Remember in grade 10 you did the like classifications of like different plants in terms of size. Herbaceous plants are quite small, you know. So yeah. And then with dicots have a more developed vascular tissue, which is why they can grow to be big. And then the leaves of dicots they branch out in like a network type of thing, and they have stalks, you know. I'm gonna try and show you this book, this figure. I hope you can see it properly, but the leaves branch out, you know. There's that middle center, and then they branch out from that, like the network, the veins of the leaves, I mean. Yeah, so that's a characteristic of a dicot. Oh, and I forgot to add that they have taproots instead of adventitious roots. So those are our features. And then reproduction in angiosperms. Angiosperms are also heterosporous, like gymnosperms, which means they produce two different types of spores: girl spores and boy spores. And more scientifically, they're known as microspores and macrospores. The microspores are the male spores, and the macrospores are the female spores. So the process of fertilization is different in angiosperms compared to gymnosperms, in a sense where double fertilization occurs, and I'm going to explain that just now. But basically, it's a similar concept that the microspore grows into a pollen grain, and then the pollen grain is either pollinated either by wind or by an insect or by a bird. But however, it leaves the male part and it goes to the female part. Okay, the male part is known as an anther, and the female part is known as a stigma, more scientifically. But yeah, it leaves that and then it goes to the female part. And then as soon as it lands into the ovule, it releases the pollen tube, and then the pollen tube allows for the sperm to be able to swim to the zygote. But now, the thing that makes angiosperms so different is that two sperm cells are found in a spore. So the one fuses with the egg to form a zygote, and then the second one fuses with two polar nuclei, and that forms a let me just get the word, a triploid endosperm. Yeah, and the triploid endosperm is which grows into a cotyledon. And then so the fertilized ovule then becomes a seed, and then the zygote becomes the embryo, and the cotyledon is the food store. So that is basically a summary of reproduction in angiosperms. Thank you so much for tuning into my video. Do tune into the next one where I'll be doing alteration of generations. Thank you. Please hit like, subscribe. Your feedback will be greatly appreciated.